Welcome, everyone, both in person and online. I'm Susan Yackee, the director of the Follette School of Public Affairs. I'm delighted you could join us tonight for our conversation with Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the Follette School, as well as to thank our sponsors for supporting tonight's event. The Follette School is the home for public policy research and teaching on UW-Madison's campus, and it's one of the top policy schools in the world. We educate graduate students in our master's programs, as well as UW-Madison undergraduate students in our certificate programs. Right now, the school is experiencing tremendous growth, doubling the size of our faculty and almost quintupling the number of students that we serve, all within the last 5 years. Demand for policy education is at an all-time high, and our undergraduate certificate programs in public policy and health policy are wildly popular, allowing us to educate more future leaders than ever before. To better serve those students and position the Follette School for future growth, we're taking steps now to create the university's first undergraduate major in public policy, and we plan to hire 4 distinguished faculty members during this upcoming year, bringing more policy area expertise to our school. Finally, we're working toward a potential new home on campus to house our growing number of students, faculty, and staff. These are very exciting changes, and they will position the Follette School to better address the most pressing policy challenges facing our country. Part of that growth is funded by a $10 million investment in the school by former Senator Herb Kohl, and we are so grateful for that gift. That generous investment has changed the trajectory of the Follette School, and it enables us to convene events like tonight, where we can contribute to thoughtful and civil dialogue around public policy issues and solutions. I also want to thank another sponsor and partner for the Follette School, American Family Insurance, whose financial support also helped make this evening possible. American Family shares the Follette's commitment to developing future leaders and serving as a strong community leader and partner. American Family's chair-elect and CEO, Bill Westrate, is here to introduce the speaker, so let me close by introducing you to Bill. Bill began his career at American Family Insurance in 1996 as an actuary and steadily rose through the leadership ranks to become COO in 2014 and CEO in 2022. Bill has a passion for community and social impact and progressing American Family's diversity and inclusion initiatives. In one of his early actions as CEO, Bill signed the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion Pledge, an agreement to take action to cultivate an environment where diverse experiences and perspectives are welcomed, and to support other companies in doing the same. Those seem like perfect themes to emphasize for tonight's talk. Bill also has served as the board chair for United Way of Dane County, and he currently serves on their executive committee. Please join me in welcoming Bill Westrate.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction, Susan. It's great to be here with all of you. It's an honor for American Family Insurance to partner with the Follette School of Public Affairs to sponsor this event. Tonight, Follette students and all of us have a unique opportunity to get firsthand insight from a former House Speaker and Vice Presidential candidate, especially given the uncertainty and polarity in politics today. I expect that we will learn a lot about bridging political divides, something that Speaker Ryan has a lot of experience with from his time in Congress, and a major focus for the Follette School. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Paul Ryan. I'm very grateful that he's here tonight and to share his perspective with all of us. Paul was the youngest Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in nearly 150 years, serving in the role from 2015 to 2019. During his time as Speaker, he spearheaded efforts to reform the tax code, national defense, domestic energy production, the opioid epidemic, and the criminal justice system. In 2012, Paul was selected as Governor Mitt Romney's vice presidential nominee. He's a Janesville native and he was first elected to Congress at the age of 28 and represented Wisconsin's 1st District for 2 decades. In recent years, Paul has taken a step back from politics, but he cares deeply about our country and continues to work tirelessly to improve it. In 2019, he launched the American Idea Foundation, a nonprofit organization that aims to expand economic opportunity by partnering with local organizations and academics to advance evidence-based public policies. Paul is also the co-editor of a new book, American Renewal, which offers a conservative plan to improve the American economy. Speaker Ryan spent today talking with students and visiting with university leadership. We are grateful that he took the time to engage with the UW and La Follette School community, and we are pleased to have him here tonight. Now, La Follette School Director Susan Webb Yackee will lead this conversation with Speaker Ryan and discuss questions submitted by the audience. So please join me in a warm welcome for Speaker Paul Ryan.
Afternoon, everybody.
Paul Ryan, we are so excited to welcome
Thanks for having
you
me.
to
Nice to
UW
be back
Madison.
on campus.
We're delighted you're here. I also want to welcome our audience. Thanks for coming out tonight. There are a lot of folks that are live streaming as well, so welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. As Bill mentioned, before the event, we asked all of our audience members to submit some questions, and we received an overwhelming response. We're going to try to get through some of those tonight. And those, no surprise, ranged from bridging political divides to public policy issues, which I know we're going to get into, as well as lessons from your time in Congress and in politics. So here's our first question, which focuses more on the teaching of our next generation of leaders. So there's significant interest in higher education right now, including here on UW-Madison's campus in civil dialogue, in teaching our students to talk and to listen across different points of view. And this is a major priority for the La Follette School, and this happens to be an issue that's really near and dear to my heart. If you were teaching one of our La Follette School classes about collaborating across difference, what advice would you give our students?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be back on campus. I got to do that just this afternoon with La Follette students. So thanks again, Susan. I actually teach. I teach at Notre Dame these days as an adjunct in the economics department, and so I experience this on a regular basis. First thing I tell them is put the phone down, stop getting sucked in with social media, because what happens in today's society, you're going to pick social media, you're going to pick all your feeds, and it's going to algorithmically feed you back what you believe, and it's going to play on your biases. And that's the world we live in today, and that's the world our young people are experiencing. They didn't grow up in the time like us, the X-Gen grew up in, where you actually had to debate with people and you had to have interactions with people who weren't like you. Today, you can just stay in your cocoon. So the advice I give is basically twofold. Get out of your cocoon, spend time with people who do not look or think like you, and do not impugn people's motives. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use it in that proportion. This was the advice my mom always gave me. And the key thing I try to impart with younger folks is, just because a person doesn't agree with you doesn't mean they're a bad person. Think about what they're saying, try to find some empathy. In Congress, when you're running the place, you look for Venn diagrams on everything. Where is the overlap so you can get things done? See if you can find overlap in common ground. And then when you debate a person, don't do it based on emotion. Don't focus on emotion and division. Focus on facts and principles, irreducible principles, and try to see if there's common ground to be had there. So without impugning people's emotions, without going after emotional-laden arguments, if you can ground your beliefs in facts and principles, you're going to have a nice conversation, and think about maybe you don't know everything at a young age, and that you can learn from another person with a different perspective. Just introducing that idea, I think, these days is sort of contrarian to what they're experiencing.
So now I'm already going off script. All right. So earlier today, when Speaker Ryan was with our graduate students, you were talking about some of these issues, and one of the things you were mentioning was that you think that data and evidence and science can actually start to bridge some of our partisan divides, and I thought that was fascinating. Can you share with our audience here some of that thinking?
Yeah, it's actually an experience I had. I was chair of the Ways and Means Committee at the time, and I wanted to reform the disability program. The Social Security disability program was going bankrupt, and I met with some economists who gave me this idea that I liked a lot called the benefit offset. I would try to be quick here. If you're disabled...
If you're going wonky, we're all wonky
I'm going to try
here. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so if you're on disability, and you make, this is in that year, if you make $1,060 a month in outside income doing something else because you were maybe disabled from doing the manual labor you did, but you could do something else. I had a buddy who, in Janesville, was paralyzed from here on down, so he helped another buddy of ours do taxes. He was a tax practitioner. And if you make $1,060 in outside income, you can keep your disability payments. But if you make $1,061, you lose all your disability payments. So we had this idea, let's do a benefit offset. For every $3 in outside income you earn, you lose $1 in benefits. And it can kind of go up and down. He was doing seasonal work, tax season. You would think the world was coming to an end. I mean, the protesters, they bust people up from Chicago to my church at St. John Vianney in Janesville to protest me. It was just the end of the world. And what I realized was just we were in these ideological, weaponized stalemates, and nothing got done. So I backed up and thought, why don't we just do a pilot project and let's just get some evidence and see if this is a good idea. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. And I ended up talking with some economists at Harvard, a guy named Raj Chetty, who did this really interesting study on upward mobility in America. And I had him fly down. That's the cool thing in Congress is you can pretty much call anybody you want and talk to them. So I had this guy come and walk me through his seminal study on upward mobility in America on a census tract basis. Long story short, he said, I just talked my way into this data from the federal government and was able to do this. I went to Notre Dame and met with these poverty economists and told them about Raj Chetty. And I said, wouldn't that be great if the rest of us in the economics field could get access to this data on federal poverty programs? Then we could measure what works and what doesn't. We could look at evidence. And the light bulb went off in my head. I called a buddy of mine, a progressive Democrat from Washington State, Patty Murray. She and I used to do a bunch of budget deals together. And we did a bill to have a commission for how to release federal data in a privacy-compliant way on all federal programs, not just poverty programs, so that academics, like people at universities, can study the effectiveness of our policies. We took that commission's finding, put it in a law. It's the last law I wrote. It's what my foundation works at executing now. And my theory in all of this is there's a new wing of social science we call evidence-based policymaking. It can get us past these ideological stalemates, this partisan bitterness, and we can have a debate on facts and using economics, randomized control trials, data and analytics. What works, what doesn't work. Let's measure the war on poverty based on outcomes and results, not on input and effort. And then we can have a better debate about what works and what doesn't, and that can help you leapfrog this political stalemate we've had. And we're just at the beginning of this sort of new wave of social science. And I'm actually very excited about it. That's what our Janesville Foundation does. Because if we can have a debate that is full of facts, full of data, rigorous analysis, then we can forget about all the name-calling and all the ideological warfare, and just focus on what works and what doesn't. And so that, to me, was sort of an epiphany I had when I was in Congress. And it's what I spend a lot of my time working on now. And I think it's one of the ways we can get past a lot of these stalemates we have these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree with you more. It's actually the mission of the LaFollette School to bring evidence to the policymaking process. So we are of like minds. I think you started to answer this question already, but I want to drill in on it because I know since you've left Congress, you've spent a lot of attention on poverty policy and entitlement reforms. How can we make better public policy in these areas that is evidence-based, as well as serving our most vulnerable in society?
Yeah, I'm actually excited about this because I think with technology, we can make a big stride, and with new evidence that's being constantly amassed, we're kind of learning what works and what doesn't work. And I want to be brief. I want to respect all the other questions you have, but I think we can look at the evidence of what works to get a person out of poverty, what doesn't. Invariably, it requires some combination of benefits that fits that person or family's need. And what typically happens right now is you combine those benefits and then something happens in their lives. That's a good thing. A wage increase, a promotion, a second job, something, and it knocks them back in benefits if they take that. We call these benefit cliffs. So you take 3 steps forward, then you end up advancing, and then you take 4 steps back. And that's the way our federal poverty safety net works as it was designed in the 20th century. It's incongruent. And so I think with technology today, and this is one of our big projects we're working on, you can combine through digital technology the benefits, put them in such a way that have the right incentive structures for education and work, for getting off of addiction, and then make sure that you smooth those benefit cliffs for every individual, every family in such a way that it always pays to take the step ahead. And you can do this in such a way that the evidence proves we can do a better job of getting people out of poverty. We can do a better job of going at the root causes of poverty. So I'm actually really excited about this sort of new wave of poverty reduction. We spent more than $15 trillion, more than 50 years in the war on poverty. And there have been a lot of successes, no two ways about it, but I don't think we're nearly as far along as we should have been based on all the effort. And I think there's a lot of stuff that really isn't left or right. It's just what works and what doesn't. And I'm actually bullish on the future of this. So I think with digital technology, the right incentive structures, and experimentation at the local and state level, and getting the public sector and private sector involved, getting charities involved more in a better integrated way, I really think we can move the needle on poverty and upward mobility in America.
So last year, the LaFollette School launched the results of our first ever policy poll, where we gauged how Wisconsinites feel about our most pressing policy topics. The results from that poll showed that climate change ranks as one of the top issues for many Wisconsin residents. And one of the neat things about the results is that while more Democrats did rank climate change highly than Republicans, there's really widespread support across the political spectrum for doing something about climate change. From your vantage point, how do you see policymakers addressing climate change over the next few years?
Give me the timeline again.
Few years.
Yeah, a few years. I think I have a preferred personal solution, and we wrote it about in this book that we released at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm not a fan of the Inflation Reduction Act.
It's called American Renewal. You can download it. It's free.
It's free. It's free to aei.org. I'm not a fan of the Inflation Reduction Act because it practices what I would call an industrial policy that sort of subsidizes today and yesterday's technologies. So I'm not a big fan, because I've watched this over and over again, of going to Washington to get your preference, get your subsidy to do whatever it is you want to do. I think it is far better economics to and I think decarbonizing is the right thing to do. So let me just say for the record, I think it's good to get carbon out of the atmosphere. So then the question is, what's the smartest, best way to go about doing it? How do you do it in a way that it doesn't sacrifice economic growth? And how do you do it in a way that encourages innovation? Because I think in this debate, from my persuasion, from the right side of the aisle, I think a lot of these ideas give too much power to the state or will slow down economic growth. And I don't want to sacrifice economic growth. I don't want to have I don't want to have to give up economic growth in order to decarbonize the economy. I think you can do both. So the way I would do it is send price signals on carbon through the tax system. So what we propose here is, and I spent my career in tax policy, is having a business tax reform. I won't get into the details, that is consumption-like for businesses, and putting on top of that a border-adjustable carbon tax. And what I mean when I say that is, you put a carbon tax embedded in the economy that's border-adjustable. So when we export something, that tax is removed. When we import something, that tax is placed upon it. That's how you get the carbon coming over from India. That's how you get the carbon coming over from China. Oh, and it's how you get the world on a system where we're sending price signals on carbon. We're the largest economy. If we do a border-adjustable carbon tax, it's going to really, really encourage other countries to follow suit. And the reason I think that's much better economics is you're sending signals through the marketplace so that carbon-intensive energy and carbon-intensive goods are more expensive. That gives much more of an incentive for innovators, for technologists, companies, businesses, service providers to come up with less carbon-intensive or carbon-free energy, carbon-free goods and services that can be more economically viable because you've raised the price of target to the carbon tax. And it gives you revenue to the federal government to get your other tax policies in a good pro-growth state. So the net result is a pro-growth tax code that's good for jobs, it's good for economic growth, good for opportunity, and deals with decarbonizing in the most efficient way possible so you don't have to sacrifice economic growth. Now that was like, what, 14 sentences? It's pretty hard to pack through what I just said in some cute little soundbite in this day and age. But I personally think that's way better than all these subsidies and all this regulation and running all this money through Washington. You're going to get a lot of cylindros, you're going to get a lot of boondoggles, and I just don't think it's good policy.
So you're pricing in carbon finally, right? You're really bringing in the full cost of climate change into pricing. Can that pass Congress?
No, that's why I asked you the timeline. So, hey, the great thing about being a think tank guy is I get to, come up with ideas at think tanks and not actually pass them into law. Having said that, I mean, that's what I'm back to my old love, which is the policy stuff that I always, worked on before and during Congress. What we proposed in the tax system here, I believe, look, we'll get into the fiscal policy, but we're going to have to rethink how we do our fiscal policy in the 21st century so that we can have a good 21st century, so we can stave off a debt crisis, address these issues, and among those issues is decarbonizing our economy. So I think there's going to be a day where, and it's not now, where we have very unserious politics now. I assume you're going to get into this, but our politics are so unserious right now that those kinds of comprehensive solutions aren't in the offing. But I've learned you never get things like that done unless you try and work at it for years. So I do think there will be a day and age, because I'm an optimist, that we will get serious politics. We will have serious policymakers willing to take political risk and do big things like this. Look, Churchill said it the best way. The Americans figured out the right thing to do, but only after they've exhausted all the other possibilities. So I think that's how we roll.
So you mentioned China. David from Madison in our audience asks this question about China. He writes, economic competition with China is one of the defining issues of our times. Did both political parties make a mistake in 2016 when they turned against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have provided a coalition of nations along the Pacific Rim to counterbalance Chinese economic influence in the region?
Yes.
David, you're right.
Totally right. Yeah, I was speaker then, but before I was speaker, I was Ways and Means chair, and I wrote the law called Trade Promotion Authority, which gives presidents the power to go negotiate trade agreements. I did this for Obama. Remember, I just ran against the guy in the last election, but I agreed with him. I think he was a little late on the trade game. Frankly, if President Obama started his trade agenda a year earlier, we would have gotten it done. We ran out of clock. But TPP is a really smart thing to do. It's very good for our China policy. It basically says America and our Asian allies in the democracies in Asia, we collectively will write the rules of the international road, especially in Asia. And being part of this trade agreement, which was negotiated by the Obama administration, they did a pretty good job. That would have been very much in our interest. And unfortunately, when we were trying to move this bill through Congress, both the Democrat and the Republican nominees, Clinton and Trump, came out against it. And it just destroyed our support for it. So we couldn't get it done. And nobody since Obama, who's been president, has been in favor of it since. I think it's a big mistake. I think we're reeling as a part of it, as a result of it. And I think it would be good if we got, and it's not too late to rejoin it. The agreement we have with Mexico and Canada is basically TPP just for North America. So if we extend that to the other Pacific nations that are our allies, I think it would be a good move in the right direction.
So you may have heard that we appear to be on the verge of a federal government shutdown.
I've seen the movie before.
Yeah.
Yep.
You're probably the right person to ask this question. What's your assessment of the current situation? Where are the opportunities for bipartisan compromise? And if Speaker McCarthy was here, what advice does former Speaker Paul Ryan give him?
He knows what I think. There are two people that I feel really sorry for these days. Aaron Rodgers and Kevin McCarthy. And, yeah, I mean, I know exactly what he's going. He has it worse than I did because he has this big of a margin. What's frustrating about this is I think Kevin did a great deal with President Biden on the debt limit deal. It's a good agreement. It was enforceable spending caps. It had the chance to bring a real workable appropriations process for the first time in a while. And the majority of the Republican conference voted for it. The majority of the Democratic conference voted for it. We'll talk about one of those Venn diagram issues. I don't know, 3-4 days later, a minority of the Republican majority, a handful of members on the Freedom Caucus, a caucus I know extremely well, a handful of these members decided to blow it up, to stop the House from operating, bring it to a screeching halt, and in order to turn Congress back on, to do anything, they basically demanded that the House not participate in putting that bill together. And they blew up the appropriations process. Now, predictably, with that blown up appropriations process, we're coming to the end of the fiscal year, and here we are. I have a hard time seeing how he gets out of this without a shutdown. My old governing partner from the other side of the Capitol, Mitch McConnell, has this Kentucky saying, which is, there's no good lesson in the second kick of a mule. So when you shut down the government over and over again, it's just, there's no lesson to be made here. Problem is, more than half of our members were never there for a government shutdown. They're leaning into this. There's a bunch of people who think this is, like, for some reason in their interest. So I fear that that's going to happen. And I don't want to get too technical in all of this, but at the end of the day, I think Speaker McCarthy, like the majority of his conference wants, is going to honor that spending agreement he had with Biden. Unfortunately, those bills were written by the Senate, and the House didn't really get to participate in that. But when those bills are ready, he'll bring them to the floor, and they'll pass with an overwhelming bipartisan vote. But when the Speaker does that, he knows he will do that and blow himself up in the process. Because these members are saying, if you do that, if you do a bipartisan way out of this, we will move to vacate you. Which is frankly how I came to the job with John Boehner. Same guys did the same thing to Boehner. But they're not offering a solution. So they're saying, if you bring a bipartisan bill to the floor that honors the agreement that a majority of Republicans in the House, in the Senate, and Democrats agreed with, that we minority don't agree with, we're going to blow you up and get you to remove you as Speaker. And they offer no other alternative solution. And they know we can't even pass a bill. The Republicans can't pass a bill even proposing an alternative. So it's nihilism is what it is. And it's really unfortunate to see, and I think it's just a small handful of members, a handful, and I think they think they win by losing. I think they think they win under any scenario.
Do they? Do they win when they lose?
No, we look like fools. We look like we can't govern. But at the end of the day, I think Kevin, he will bring a bill that honors that agreement, that funds appropriations. We need to rebuild the military. There's a lot of things the military needs right now that they didn't even know about last year. Artificial intelligence. There's a lot I can go on about this. And so I think Kevin will have to endure a motion to vacate vote. Hopefully there's a bipartisan vote for the sake of the institution to support him. I believe there will be. Only from my own conversations with Nancy over the years, I think institutionally, if the Democrats say, let's just participate in kicking a guy out for bringing a bipartisan compromise to the floor, it doesn't speak very well to the institution.
One of our audience members wants to know a little bit about the priorities for the Republican Party going forward. What are those priorities? How can the party unite and overcome distrust? And in particular, how does former President Trump fit in?
Well, let me introduce you to American Renewal. I'm just kidding. How does Trump
Back to policy. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. That's what I prefer talking about. We've got, I'm basically, if I look at Congress and maybe the party, there's three basic types of Republicans. Moderates, conservatives, which I would consider myself, and populists. And right now, the populism that's sort of running through, there's populism on the left, there's populism on the right. The populism that's running through my party right now is not always unprincipled, but it's not tethered to a principle, it's tethered to a person. It's sort of culture war populism. And it's tethered to this personality of Donald Trump. the man with what I would say a fairly short shelf life, hopefully shorter than not. And that's a challenge we have. But if you want to be a majority party in this country, meaning a party that the majority of Americans want to support, you need to be a party that people have faith is going to solve their problems. We have a number of problems in this country that I would like to think we could get consensus on. Our social contract, which is our safety net for the poor, our health and retirement security system for Americans, is running into serious fiscal problems. It's going to compromise our economic security, our dollar as the reserve currency, our standard of living. And Democrats and Republicans are going to have a big debate about how we should fix that. We all know we need to fix it. I think we all agree we want it. We want the social safety net. We want this social contract. We want health and retirement security. So I would rather us get to a debate where our party offers its solution to these problems that we think are better than what the other folks are offering. And have an inclusive, inspirational debate.
I don't feel like I've seen any debate on that.
So that's not happening right now. So we're in Trump populism right now. And right now, I don't think we can get the debate until we get past Donald Trump. Now, I'm hoping we get past Donald Trump by, say, January, after Iowa and New Hampshire, or maybe South Carolina. If you're a betting person, if you go to the Vegas odds, I'm sure they're saying he's probably get the nomination. I still think there's a reasonable chance he doesn't get the nomination.
If not Trump, who on the Republican side of the aisle?
So the argument I make more of a practical argument. There's two reasons I don't think Trump should be the nominee or president. One is a practical, one's a principled reason. The practical reason is we lose with this guy. I mean, he won in 2016, and then we lost the House in 18 because of him. We lost 20, the presidency. We lost the Senate. Then we lost the Senate again in 2022. We lost 10 to 15 seats in 2022 in the House because of him. And if you look at the Electoral College, it's basically 4, maybe 5 states are going to determine this thing. Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and maybe Pennsylvania. And what you see when you look around these states is it's the new swing voter is not the blue-collar rural voter. That's Republican. And it's not the urban, it's not Madison and Milwaukee. It's the suburbanites. It's college-educated suburbanites. We call them wild counties, Washington, Ozaukee, Waukesha here. And take that to these other states. Do you think those suburban voters like Donald Trump more since January 6th? I mean, good grief. They didn't vote for him this last time. They're not going to vote for him again. So I try to make more of a practical argument to would-be Trump supporters that we lose with the guy, pick somebody else. But I think given Biden's weaknesses, he's weak in the polling. I think you also have to make another argument, which is he's just unfit for office. Look, I'm an old school guy. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I think leaders should endeavor to be honest, ethical, moral people who try to set standards for themselves and lead by example for the rest of the country. Donald Trump doesn't try to do any of that. He does the opposite of it, frankly. So I just don't think he's fit for the job. The problem is, I don't know who's in this room, but people who already agree with me, they weren't going to vote for him in the first place. The challenge for our party is we got to go convince the people who are willing to vote for him not to vote for him. And I think the better argument is the electability argument. I think let me put it this way. The party that puts the first fresh face forward wins this election. If the Democrats somehow swap out Biden with I don't know who, they're going to win. If we swap out Trump, I think something easier to do, frankly, we're going to win. If it's Nikki Haley, if it's Tim Scott, if it's Mike Pence, if it's Ron DeSantis, I don't know. Maybe not that Vivek guy, but if it's, I don't know him. but if we put forward a fresh face, we're going to win. Nikki Haley had 11 good minutes in the last debate, and a week later, she's 6 points over Biden in the country. So, and the last point I'll say is don't look at these national polls. You got to look at the state by state. Look at the state polls in those 5 states, and that tells you something.
I think you started to answer this, but if you were a betting man, who would you say is going to win the next presidential election and why?
Well, I'd say if I had to bet, it'd be Biden, because if it's Biden-Trump, I think Biden wins. I personally would rather not see that. I would rather see a Republican win, not named Donald Trump. If you look at our primary field, and we've got another debate tomorrow, honestly, I'm just really looking to see who comes out of Iowa, who comes out of New Hampshire. We got 2 South Carolinians running. I think if you do the math on sort of the way it all works, by mid-February, before Super Tuesday, if we've got somebody that's shown some momentum, that could win one of these states, my hope and prayer is that the rest of the field gets the heck out of the race. Because if 2/3 of the Republicans want somebody other than Trump, but Trump's got his 33%, and it's staying with him. But if we're slicing up the other 66% with 6 people, he wins. But if we can consolidate this in time for one person, that person wins. And frankly, I don't know who it's going to be, but I think you'd say Haley, Scott, Pence, or DeSantis right now. But that's just odds. If any one of them gets the nomination, I think they win the presidency.
So my first job out of college was working on Capitol Hill. And I remember writing a lot of mail about the tax code, right? And my boss at the time had this little standard text where you'd write back and say, like, no, we need to simplify this. It needs to be able to fit it on the back of a postcard.
Who was your boss? Who did you work for?
Byron Dorgan. From
I know Byron.
Yeah,
sure.
North Dakota.
Yeah.
You have suggested that we need a simpler tax code too. Why is it so hard to simplify the federal tax code?
Interest groups. I did the last tax round where we took a lot out of the tax code. It was a real showdown. It was a real war. What invariably happens is this industry group has this special carve out in the code. It means the world to them. It's their industry as they see it. And then there's the general interest out there. So when you ever heard of SALT, the state and local tax deduction? People are pretty salty on this thing. They get pretty upset with us So when we repealed the SALT, or we reduced the SALT deduction to $10,000, we did that so that we could cut everybody's rates across the board. We did it so we could double the standard deduction and radically simplify the code. It was really, really hard to do that because every mayor and every governor came to Congress trying to convince their member of Congress not to do it. Take that and multiply that by 1,000 provisions in the tax code, and therein lies your problem. The smarter thing to do is have a broad tax base with lower rates that raises your revenue, distorts the economy as least as possible, and calls it a day. So that's why, again, back to the proposals, I think it's smarter for us to have a consumption-based type tax system on businesses so that businesses pay taxes on their net income after expenses. That makes them put money into their businesses. That makes them invest in plant and equipment and hiring people and give them really good rates so that they're globally competitive. We were able to achieve a lot of that, and that's been very successful. On the individual code, you just have to ask yourself a question. Do I want this deduction, that deduction, this deduction, the mortgage deduction, the car deduction, this deduction, or do I just want lower tax rates and I decide what to do with my money? If you do that, by the way, you end up getting faster economic growth. The challenge and the reason it's so hard to do that is the general interest, the general public likes, let me have my money and do what I want with it. But the special interests, who are the ones knocking on Congress's doors, who are just, pushing the interests, make an over loud call for their part of the code, and that's what makes it very difficult. It's why it's done once a generation. It was done in 1986, and then the tax code got riddled full of loopholes. We trimmed it back like a hedge trimming in 2017, and we just added a bunch new in this last session, loopholes.
So in your book, American Renewal, you write about 2 critical American ideas that you say no longer hold for millions of Americans. First, that the economic condition of one's birth does not determine the outcome of one's life. And second, that each generation is better off than the past generation. What are some of the ways that we can get back to these forms of prosperity? Yeah,
because if we don't, we're not going to be able to be and come together as a country, as a society. If everybody, I grew up in Janesville. My family went from a potato famine in the 1850s to Janesville. and my family's been there ever since with this belief that you can make it if you work hard and you can make your your kid's better off than you are. A lot of people don't believe that anymore because, frankly, there's some evidence that it's not true for a lot of people anymore. So going back to what I said earlier, let me say this. You can't fix our problems in this country without economic growth. Now, economic growth doesn't fix every problem, but you can't fix our problems unless you have good economic growth. And so the question is, can you have economic growth that is inclusive? Can you have economic growth that is broadly shared? And that's where I think there's a lot we can do, that we've learned a lot, frankly, in the 20th and early 21st century on how to rewrite our safety net. To rewire our safety net so it's wired for people to get skills, to get educated, to be able to climb the ladder of economic opportunity with the right kinds of incentives and the right kinds of supports. And then you want to make sure that our fiscal balance sheet is not such that we're consigned to slow economic growth. What I say in this earlier is the economic forecaster that I think is the best one out there is the Congressional Budget Office. It's the most sort of neutral, nonpartisan economic arbiter we have in the country. And the Congressional Budget Office is saying that for the next 30 years, the average rate of economic growth in America is going to be 1.3%. That's less than half of what it was for the last 30 years. So if we grow our economy for the next generation less than half the rate we grew it for the last generation, it's an enormous difference in prosperity and opportunity in upward mobility. And the main reason they say that is, this is where I'm coming to my punchline, the main reason is because of labor. So we've done a few things. The baby boomers had a whole bunch of kids. They were great at it. Now they're retiring. They're leaving the labor force. And our birth rates aren't what they need to be. No, they're not terrible. We're not Japan. Japan's literally cutting themselves in half each generation. Our birth rates need to be at 2.4. We're at 2.1. So if you can fix our immigration laws where you get the border secure, you make sure we control all the stuff that's coming over the border, but fix our immigration laws so that we can have people come and fill jobs that are not being filled. And I think you can do this in a way where you're not depressing people's wages. That's really, really an important detail. But if you can fix our immigration laws, get the labor supply where it needs to be for this coming century, fix our entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, so that they're not bankrupting the country, we're going to have a whale of a great century. We will get that 1.3% GDP up to 3% of GDP. So that's why I say fix the tax system, wire it for economic growth. If we want to decarbonize, which I think we should, you can embed a carbon policy in that. Have good immigration policies that make sense for your economy, for your security, and then get these entitlements that, my 89-year-old mom living in Janesville, Wisconsin depends on. Get them on a good financial footing. We want them, we like them. Everybody agrees with this. Get them on a good financial footing so that we can absorb the debt of the baby boomers, but they don't send us into a debt crisis. Then the dollar is going to be as good as gold. Then the dollar is going to continue to be the world's reserve currency, and our interest rates can come back to normal, and we can have a really good century. But to do those things, you have to get past the fact that we have really unserious politics right now. Our politics are just fundamentally unserious. But I think we have it in us as a country to get past this unserious phase. We just talked about, the presidential election, and get on to this problem-solving phase. And the reason I'm optimistic about all of this is I think that the center-right and the center-left more or less agree on these things. Maybe not the extremes, but I think there's a consensus to be had on how to do this. Maybe it takes a fiscal commission or something like that, but I think there's a consensus. And if we actually do that, we're going to have a great century. And that belief that is becoming more and more well-founded, that the condition of your earth doesn't determine the outcome of your life, that your kids are going to be better off, will be true. And so right now, there are a lot of poor families in multi-generational poverty that don't see it, and there are kids who are not as better off as their parents, and that all can be reversed if we get our act together as a country.
So say a little bit more about what it means to be serious in terms of public policy, because, I think all of us have seen a lot of unserious actions in government these days. How do we get back to a world where our politicians can have dialogue about some of these questions and really debate ideas as opposed to performative aspects of politics?
Yeah, I wish I had a simple answer. In the old days, like 10 years ago. You know, I thought the way to succeed in politics was a meritocracy, where you were judged whether you were a good legislator, you know, whether you could take an idea and pass it into law and make a difference. And the unit of measurement for this meritocracy was persuasion and policy. Could you come up with a good policy and persuade people it's the right thing to do? Today, we have, probably because of digitization and the coarsening of our culture, and the tribalization we have an entertainment wing of the Republican Party and an entertainment wing of the Democratic Party. We have performance artists that measure their stock and trade as, you know, provocation and entertainment. They have a brand they have to curate. These nihilists who are shutting down the House, they know it's going to hurt the Republican Party. They know it's going to make it look like we can't govern, but it's going to be good for their brand in their calculation, I think. So we've got to get past that. Okay, that's why I wish I had a good answer for your question. I think politics is supply side and demand side, and there are voters who demand a culture warrior or a fighter, you know, a grievance peddler, and from both sides. And there are politicians willing to supply that. My hope is, and there's where I think the answer to this question gets to, is we're going to have political leaders that emerge that have figured out how to supply a policy-based agenda that's popular and principled populism, that shows how to solve problems, that's anchored to principles, and is sort of inclusive and aspirational, and can get elected. And so the question is, will the political incentive structures change so that the demand side, the public, rewards politicians like that, who can win not only their primaries but then their general elections? And I think there's reasons. I look at Glenn Youngkin's campaign, and he had a really tough primary in Virginia. He won a general election. He's fixing problems. I think there's green shoots out there, and I'm just talking as a Republican. But we got to get past this Trump cult of personality populism, for my party at least, to get there. But I think we can get there. I do.
So one of our audience members, Chris from Middleton, writes this. This is a question about Speaker Ryan's evolution as a policymaker. Can you share with us your thinking on any policy issue that you didn't support as a young policymaker, but that you now do support? Or any policy position that you did believe in as a young policymaker, but that you don't now believe in?
On the first part, I'd say criminal justice reform. When I first got into Congress, Clinton was president. Everybody was tough on crime. 3 strikes, you're out. You know, massive sentencing guidelines, and we overshot. And then I spent a good chunk of time running around the country with a mentor of mine, a guy named Bob Woodson, a well-known sort of poverty fighter in the country, just learning about poverty, learning about a lot of things. And what I learned through evidence, and some states that did some pretty good reforms, that we totally screwed up our criminal justice system, the way we wrote our laws. And so the evidence showed me that we need to reform our criminal justice system, that frankly, the best way to deal with nonviolent crimes in many cases are alternatives to long prison sentences. And we've proven this in some states. So I sort of changed that position and I worked with Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley, just a kind of and Hakeem Jeffries and others, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, to pass criminal justice reform in the Trump administration. We got that done. And I think it was very good policy. It still gets hit by some on my side, but I think I realized we screwed that one up and fixed that. What's something that I don't, if sometimes you go back and look at your votes. I mean, I voted thousands of times over 20 years. I think I got the China thing wrong. I voted for China to enter the WTO for PNTR. It's a permanent normal trade relations. And I had the belief at the time, which was, I think, well-founded at the time, it was a different premier, that if China were brought into a world trading system, that they were supposed to play by the rules, and the Chinese people got more prosperity, that they would demand more freedom from their government, and that they would play by the rules. They didn't do that. I think I was wrong in that assessment and that assumption. And now I think it's really clear, and thankfully G telegraphed his punches. We know who they are, and we know what they're trying to do, and it's not in our interest, and it's definitely not in the interest of the free world. So I think that particular policy, was a misjudgment. But that's what the best thing of hindsight is.
Katie from the audience wants you to tell us a fun behind-the-scenes story from when you were speaker.
Oh, I don't know if they're fun. Man. Boy, I got to be careful what I do here. Yeah. I remember, Trump, look, you've heard what I just said about the guy, right? So we don't really get along all that well. These days, the guy has a gift for marketing. And I spent my life working on tax reform. I was on the Ways and Means Committee my whole career, working on tax bills. And Kevin Brady, who was my successor at the Ways and Means Committee, the chairman of the committee that I had just chaired when I was speaker, he's down there in the White House with Trump, and Trump is getting him to change the name of the bill. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that you know of right now, the 2017 law, he wanted to call it the Cut Act. Because he thought it was really good marketing. And Kevin, and I'm not a big texter. I mean, I'm busy being speaker. I don't have my phone on me. And my staff's like, Brady's like insistent on getting a hold of you. You got to get on this cell phone, on this conference call. He's down in the Oval, and he's not standing his ground well because Trump's telling him, rename the bill the Cut Act. And he really wanted to name it that. And they get me on the phone, and I'm like, there's no way we're going to do that. Are you, what? It's like, so long story argument, we called it the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is pretty simple phrasing of a bill. But there were a zillion stories like that. I'm trying to tell the most sanitized version of it, the one I can tell. That's about the most sanitized story I can come up with in those days. I could go on and on, but I think I'll just leave it at that.
Ben from our audience wonders, people who are vocal in the political arena tend to be more politically far left or politically far right, but voters tend to be more moderate. How can we decrease divisive political rhetoric to reflect where the majority of American voters really are?
Most people say the answer is redistricting. Actually, I think that may have been true at one time. I don't think it is anymore, because people are redistricting themselves. They're moving themselves into cul-de-sacs at areas where they are with people that think and vote like them. So that's just what's kind of happening in America. I think the thing is you got to get involved in primaries. Our problem, the Democrats have the same problem, is people who are getting through the primaries can't win general elections. And we just cost like 5 Senate seats the last cycle because of that. And so what I think most typical voters that this questioner described is a voter that votes in a general election. And the voter participates in the political process near the end. They got to get in the process faster and earlier in the primary. Because when you look at the voting turnout on primaries, it's a fraction of what it is in general elections. And it is that slice of voter. It's that very motivated voter who is either very, very right or very left, and that provides sort of a distortion of incentives in the political process to get through a primary to then get to a general election. So to me, it's about getting voters engaged earlier in the primary process, and then having people run for office who want to, stitch. The other problem is the district. You guys all know who represented Janesville, Racine, Kenosha, everything in between. I had Beloit for a while. That's pretty 50-50. I mean, literally, for 10 of my 20 years, that was the centermost district in all of America, the 218th seat. It made me a better congressman. It made me far better because I had to get Democrat votes. I had to get independent votes. I couldn't just survive on Republican votes. And so I wish, frankly, members could have that kind of an experience where they don't have just the one voice they have. And so the challenge in 80% of our congressional districts, and this isn't, statewide are a little different, 80% of our congressional districts, you're just talking to the base because that's all you need. The other 20% of the districts, you need a base, and then you got to grow it from there. And so when most of your congressional districts, and I think state legislative districts like this, all it is the base, then that primary voter has disproportionate power. So it kind of, in my mind, comes back to getting people elected in primaries that want to be legislators and policymakers, not carnival barkers and howling at the moon in Congress or in the legislature.
So we have one final question for the evening. Your chapter of American Renewal emphasizes the enormous challenges facing America today, but it also states that there are real reasons for hope. What are some of those reasons?
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic. Again, it can't get worse. So there's that, politically. But actually, technology, I'm pretty enamored with it. I think you'll have consensus in Congress on China policy, AI technology policy. So that does happen. People do talk to each other in Congress. Things do get done. But I think this technology is is going to do a lot for us as a country. I think we're learning so much more through economics how to better fight poverty. I think we're getting to a point where our debt is getting so big and so out of control that it's going to force us to do something. And when we fix it, it's going to be very good for us. So I think what happens, and same with the immigration system, we've been trying to reform it since like 1996. So I think what happens in our country is things are so intractable, and then they break and then they get fixed. And I think we're kind of moving to that moment where we're getting to these intractable problems, but they're getting so close and so serious that they will force us to solve these problems. Maybe a couple commissions are going to be needed to do it, but I think we're going to do it. We've done it before. I think we have the stuff to do it. And I think people, just as this is my experience in Wisconsin, I think people, and I spend a lot of time traveling the country still, they're yearning for fixing things. They're yearning for, putting the swords down and getting stuff done. And I do think the politician that starts tapping that, sort of a I'm a Republican, a Ronald Reagan type, I think there's a future for that political brand. And I do believe we can fix these problems. And the other point I'd say is we have all the stuff we need. We have, our continent, our resources, our strength, our freedoms, all of these things. We have what we need to do to regenerate our country right here in our country, in our continent. So I'm actually pretty bullish about it if we get our politics right. So I think we will. Again, it goes back to Churchill. The Americans can be counted upon to do the right thing, here's the other, they can count upon to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other opportunities. But democracy is being tested. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Democracy is being tested from within and from without. You know what's going on with Russia. We know what's going on with China. That we understand, and I think we can get bipartisan consensus on how to deal with that. It's the internal stuff. It's the tearing us apart. It's the polarization. We get that figured out, and we get this done. There's nothing stopping us. And I think we will. I'm actually just an optimistic person because all of our country's problems, the solutions are within, they're not external, they're within our own power to solve these problems. And because of that, I think we'll get it right, and I think we'll have a good century. So I'm actually pretty optimistic. So the solutions are within our reach. They are. Well, that's a perfect message to end on. Thank you, Speaker Ryan, for spending time with us tonight. For everybody in the audience, stay tuned for more and future La Follette School events. And please join me in thanking Speaker Paul Ryan. Thank you. All right. All right. Thanks. Thanks. That was nice. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.